Hello and welcome to our third of four in a series. We're talking with Erica Meier, president of Animal Outlook, about doing a little retrospective on some of the work that's been done and experiences around some of our programs and highlights of our work in the last 15 years. And today we're going to be talking about legal advocacy, but we've already talked about veg outreach and corporate engagement in our first two talks. So please check those out if you haven't. But let's get into it with legal advocacy. So I want to go way back and set the stage here. So, the first campaign or program action that I think back in the day, Compassion Over Killing, now Animal Outlook, was really known for is the animal care certified work. So there's a lot of history behind that and why it became a focus of an animal advocacy organization. I don't think people necessarily think about labeling and misleading advertising as the first thing that comes to mind necessarily when they think about helping animals. They don't even necessarily think about using the law as a way to help animals. So let's start way back in the day. Now it's about 16, 17 years ago that the genesis of this idea came about. And what was the thinking here? What was going on? How did you kind of identify what was happening and identify it as a problem? And then think, yeah, we can use the law to resolve this problem.
Yeah, well, the Animal Care Certified campaign, it's such a sort of great narrative of blending issues together of consumer protection and animal protection. And it preceded me. So the organization had already taken up this campaign when I started, and I helped continue push it forward. And we soon after that reached victory. So basically the premise of the campaign, though, and why we initiated it as an organization was because the egg industry had started talking about this animal care certified program that was voluntary for egg producers across the US to engage in. And the program, once they decided to participate, allowed them to use a claim on their cartons called Animal Care Certified. And it would start appearing on egg cartons nationwide. And we started to look into what is animal care certified? What does it really mean for these birds? And what does it mean to consumers who are now buying those cartons with that stamp on it? And what we started to discover is in undercover investigations, we would go inside an animal care certified farm and we would go inside a farm that was not animal care certified. And they essentially were identical, especially in the conditions for the hens and the way we saw birds living inside these tiny wire cages, crammed inside. And they were living on the wire mesh. And sometimes we'd find dead hens inside the cages with live hens who had been stuck on the cages, like their wings are stuck or their beaks are stuck. And this was true no matter which kind of a farm we went into. So we then started conducting our own polls to find out, what does this mean to consumers? We'd ask them, how do you think these birds are treated? And it was clear that animal care certified meant the world to the egg industry in terms of marketing, but it meant next to nothing for hens. And it meant a lot to consumers who thought they were buying eggs from birds who were given a higher level of care than was reality. And so that's when we realized we need to present this case as a consumer fraud case.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting, also obviously having come into this while it was already in progress, is I remember having the realization that if all of the work that the animal advocacy movement is doing, all of the interest that people have in helping animals, can just be twisted into the industry coming up with some clever marketing tactics to tell you that the problem has been solved, and they get away with, making more money out of it and not really doing anything differently. And by the way, the side effect of kind of pushing off being further regulated, right? Like they're basically saying, hey, we're handling this ourselves. We're going to regulate ourselves. Then everything that well-meaning people, consumers, advocates, anyone who has an interest in, the better treatment of animals, all the way to, total abolitionism, is really thwarted in their efforts, because you're then having a conversation with somebody who is just telling you what you want to hear. And without these investigations and without the kind of accountability that comes from legal work, you can't stop that from becoming the norm. So I think, even though I think from the point of view of thinking, okay, what of the options out there to help animals, what might come to the surface, maybe going after industry marketing doesn't, come to mind first. It really is a core issue, because without addressing this issue, how can you be making progress? You're kind of talking on facts that are quicksand, right? And you don't.
Yeah, and some of these marketing schemes are coming out of the reality that as the conditions on factory farms are being exposed and consumers are responding with outrage, then the industry has decided one way they can address it is by putting a happy marketing scheme on their products to make consumers feel better about what they're buying, when in reality, there's, as you mentioned, there's no accountability. There's no one checking to see, does this marketing plan match what's really happening for animals? Is that meaning translating into something different for the birds? And instead, Animal Care Certified was a great example of the industry making itself sound really lovely, but what it really did was just codify the already existing industry norms. Nothing had really changed. They basically took one bird out of every cage. And in terms of the way the program ended up impacting birds. So you still have these tiny wire cages stacked up and stacked up and stacked up with the fecal waste dropping down into these newer pits below that is accumulating this stench of ammonia that is, when you walk into one of these places, it just stings your eyes and your nose. And so the industry is basically, their response to a lot of consumer outrage about what's happening on factory farms is to just make it sound nicer. And that's where we came in and said, no, we consumers deserve to know the truth about what's really going on here.
Yeah, I think, they're making it sound nicer because they're taking advantage of the people who care about this enough to try to educate themselves about it. So they want to have a response to that question that they're anticipating, because they know people are starting to care. So it's not just sort of, misrepresenting or putting a pretty picture like all advertisers do. They'll sort of put pretty pictures on things. It's a response to, a real sincere desire to do better. And it's manipulating that response for, their own purposes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what happened in that case. So how did that, the genesis of it was realizing that there was this problem, right? Mm-hmm. And that came through the investigations, that came through some research about what the industry was doing. The fact that this was a label that was happening on, most of the egg industry players were part of this program.
Yeah.
And so that was all over the country. So how then to decide, yes, there is something here, we have a chance of winning, and how did that actually play out in terms of the legal?
Yeah, so there was a decision to put together a case to bring forward to the Better Business Bureau, and that required a lot more research and expert statements and official polls demonstrating the difference between what consumers believe is happening and the reality for birds. And all of that was presented to the Better Business Bureau, which took the case on and ultimately decided that Animal Care Certified was in fact misleading and should be removed from egg cartons. And so the egg industry came back and appealed the case. So it went to the appeal board of the Better Business Bureau, and they basically just stood by its original ruling and said, no, this is still misleading. It needs to be removed. It needs to be changed or removed. And the egg industry didn't respond to it. They didn't really take any action. So eventually we worked with some folks who managed to get the Federal Trade Commission involved. So the Federal Trade Commission looked at the case and decided they wanted to intervene. And they came in, and ultimately what happened is the egg industry changed its logo from Animal Care Certified to Animal Care Certified. United Egg Producer Certified, I should say. United Egg Producer Certified. So that's the name of the trade group, United Egg Producers. And now in egg cartons nationwide, you might see United Egg Producers as a small logo somewhere on there as being part of this voluntary program. The program itself has not changed in terms of the way in which animals are treated, but the marketing scheme has changed so that there is no longer this misleading animal care certified claim on egg cartons.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think even though this is, we're talking about 15 years ago, 16 years ago now, I think the fact that FTC would still be an avenue to use, Better Business Bureau would still be an avenue to use for anyone who is looking now at misleading labeling and claims by the industry around humane treatment of animals or other things that, should, for anyone who sees something like humane on a package, that should really, kind of raise your suspicions. And it's something that I think has been kind of entrenched in animal law and animal advocacy since then. I think that, and for good reason, the industry really does need to be aware that there are people watching, because otherwise I think they're going to be able to understand the trends in consumer interest and consumer caring about these issues and get ahead of it to the point where, nobody has a real chance at understanding what's actually going on. I mean, even, I would say when we go into an egg facility to do an investigation, we could write a list of what we know is going to be going on, regardless of whether they're part of this program or not, right? I mean, there's always going to be crowding. You're always going to have dead birds in cages with live birds. You're always going to have damaged cages that are causing injuries, illnesses. You're going to see things that, there's probably going to be something, that might be a little surprising, but there's, you can write basically the book before you even go into the place.
Yeah, and it's a horror show no matter what.
Yeah, and I think being able to communicate that to people, or at least prevent the communication of the opposite message, is really important.
Yeah, well, what actually came out of that case too is, we started to look further at egg cartons and the misleading nature of other marketing claims and imagery. So there are images on some cartons of like happy birds standing outside or sitting on a nest. There are claims of naturally raised or, vegetarian fed, all these different claims, many of which, when it relates to how the birds are being treated, have very little to do with how the birds are actually being treated. So like naturally raised, what does that claim mean? And so what we did is decide, we got rid of Animal Care Certified. This was, a nationwide marketing scheme through the egg industry. But what about all the individual little claims we're seeing on different cartons popping up and the images that are also misleading? And so we decided to file rulemaking petitions with the federal government, 3 different agencies, trying to get a proactive claim on egg cartons, identifying with clear labeling how the eggs were produced. And we wanted eggs from caged hens, if they're free range and cage free, and it would be something that would have to be regulated and somebody would check to make sure what's really happening inside these facilities and what's going on. And that type of labeling is available to consumers in the United Union or the European Union. And so what's interesting is when we started to ask for this federally, which it ultimately did not succeed, but I do think that that's a case that is still worthy of making and pushing forward, is the egg industry just started to fight back. And it's clear they no longer wanted to admit, like they, started to acknowledge we don't want labeling like this proactive labeling, which makes you wonder, like, if you're not willing to say these eggs are from caged hens, why are you hiding so much? What is it that you're hiding? And it just sort of allowed us to have a further conversation publicly about what's going on that the industry doesn't want you to know.
Exactly. And, again, cages are not just cages. They come with all sorts of inherent cruelty that is part of using the cage system. Yeah. One thing that I thought was really interesting in that whole process is understanding the difference between the egg industry and some other animal product industries, where people buy eggs thinking that they're getting something local, something small, kind of the local farmer down the road. And in reality, it's these stacks of cages that go as far as the eye can see, and it's absolutely disgusting. But people don't have the same kind of brand loyalty to eggs as they do just to other kinds of products. So you might go to your grocery store and, have an image on your carton that's this cute little, chick wandering on a field, or a little, cartoon farmer. I remember pulling one that had kids wearing a little bonnet, and there's a hen running around, and those are just, the same as everybody else, right? The same egg packing facility could be sending out multiple cartons because they want to give that impression of that old school sort of old McDonald's farm image. Yeah. And I think that's something that is unique to the egg industry. Like there are lots of misleading labels in all sorts of places, but the egg industry plays with the fact that consumers don't necessarily have, they're not going to go out and buy the, super brand name eggs like they would with milk, right? So they might go out and buy, Nestle or something, which is a massive company. Everybody knows is a massive company if they buy milk, but they're not really going to do the same for eggs. So they're going to feel like they're getting this cute little local farm. And in fact, they're getting this massive factory farm. And that's just business as usual, which I thought was a really interesting element of the egg industry that we kind of found from that. Also on eggs. So another old case that I think put a lot of things in perspective for me, at least, that I still think use to this day is the Esben Shade case. So that was an undercover investigation. Resulted in a lot of firsts in terms of the law there. So let's talk about that. How did that come about, and kind of what lessons do you remember, kind of interesting takeaway pieces all these years later do you have on that case?
Yeah, well, I think it was coming off the heels of Animal Care Certified. So that was in 2005 and 6 is when that case, the Animal Care Certified case, was resolving with the Better Business Bureau and the Federal Trade Commission. And then I think it was 2006 and 7 is when we investigated Esben Shade Egg Farm, which is a massive egg factory farm located in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And we had one of our staff members go undercover inside the facility, wear a hidden camera, got a job, wore a hidden camera, and documented the day-to-day abuses. And what was interesting about this case was it was a standard battery cage facility, and a lot of what we documented were standard abuses, and they were really horrific to see. I mean, this was everything you'd imagine bad about an egg factory farm, from the stench and the filth to the birds getting stuck on the wires of the cages, their beaks getting stuck, dead birds living in cages with live birds, birds, who were dying and pulled out of their cages, just left in the aisle, barely able to move, left to just, die right there. And we, in Pennsylvania, and you can probably explain this better than I can as a lawyer, but in Pennsylvania, there is a way to take action regarding the protection of animals through peace officers. And we worked with a humane officer in that jurisdiction who looked at our videotape, was horrified, and decided to bring the case forward into court. And in that case, the charges were against the manager and the owner of the facility. It was the first ever case in which an owner and a manager were charged with cruelty to animals, not the individual employees working inside the facility on a day-to-day basis, but those responsible for the facility were charged. And they were both charged with, I think, 70-something counts of cruelty. Do you remember?
I think it was 35 for one and 34 for the other.
Okay, so 70 total.
Yeah, and it was really, I thought what was so interesting about it too was, if you look at the cases on animal cruelty, it's always these smaller facilities, or it's, dogs and cats or whatever. And this was the first time that you're talking about really taking, an industry player doing major factory farming to task using this law.
Yeah. And that case, it went to court. There were several different court dates and witnesses. We brought in experts who testified to the cruel nature of this facility, to the cruel nature of battery cages, which is the term for the wire cages in these factory farms. And so the case, got an incredible amount of media attention, which also helped us expose consumers to this reality that they may never have even heard about or known about before. And it gave us that platform of having the discussion of, how are animals on factory farms treated, and how do these laws protect or not protect them in the ways that we think these, cruelty laws protect dogs and cats. And so ultimately the judge, in her response during the trial, she was horrified by the footage, horrified by the description. She decided to not take any action in the case. And so they were not found guilty. And she sort of admitted that she didn't want to be a maverick in the case. I mean, I don't remember the exact details of how she presented it, but she essentially just said, this doesn't sound right, but it's not, I'm not going to be the one to make a ruling that brings into question this factory farming practice in the entire state. So, so there was no guilty verdict in that case.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that really sticks with me about that case, she said that she didn't have any doubt that, she found the evidence itself to be credible, right? There was no, so most of their defense was trying to discount the credibility of the investigator. They're always asking like, are you vegan? And those sorts of questions. If that means we can, completely like change what a video image looks like. That idea, I think that's very insidious that we would ever even think about altering video, right? That would be just so absolutely beyond the pale. That's the opposite of what we're here to do. So, I remember actually researching, like, can they even make that argument if they have no evidence? Because, they were asked in court, like, do they have any evidence? And they said no. But that didn't even fly. That wasn't even what the issue was for her. She said, no, that's, the evidence is credible. The witness is credible. And then the other big defense that the facility was making, and they used their experts for this, was that this place was generally speaking a normal operation. And that's part of what we're always running into with these states that have the exemptions. And that's not even what she was thinking about. That wasn't the issue for her. She said, no. The issue was, she didn't think the legislature told her what to do about commercial facilities versus non-commercial facilities, which I think legally is a real, you could get into the absurdity of that kind of logic. But I think in a bigger way, it kind of says exactly what you just said. Is like, what, like, I don't want to be the person who has to step out and say there's progress here.
Yeah.
Which to me is a real lesson. I mean, it's frustrating, but it's a real lesson.
Because we are also arguing, as cruel as this is, it's not egregious cruelty of the type of abuse where somebody is intentionally harming an animal by throwing them against the wall. What we're arguing is the nature of this operation, which is a battery cage facility, a wire cage facility, is inherently cruel. And I think there was a lot of agreement on the horror of what was being witnessed, but there was a reluctance to make a precedent-setting decision. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, I think about that case all the time because I think it really does. It pulls a lot of threads together, both legally and then just thinking about, the people involved, like who are the people who are kind of the gatekeepers for progress and what it is we can do here. So a lot of firsts there and a lot of lessons, I think, still to this day.
Yeah, but it was quite an experience, going to court and having that that experience of knowing like these cases can be taken seriously enough to make it to that level. Because in a lot of cases, they don't even go to court or there aren't even charges filed. So that was, that was an experience. I think it was a big learning lesson on a lot of fronts for us.
Yeah, the idea that a factory farm for neglect could actually result in trial. And if the trial was sort of stretched over time, there are multiple days, multiple witnesses, like, that was real kind of new thing. And I don't think that the industry people who were in the audience on the other side had even crossed their mind that this could happen.
And going back to the idea of like, you were just starting on board when this case was being investigated and going to court. And so that was in 2006 when you had started. And that was a 4-person staff organization was taking on this factory farm.
Yeah. And they'd really packed the seats in the courtroom. And okay, so let's jump a couple years in time and talk about Cal Cruz.
Yeah.
So first thing that comes to mind, like what is the first, because it was such a big thing. There was a lot of work that went into this, but what is kind of sticks in your mind after all these years with that case?
Well, that was an interesting case because it was a chicken and duck hatchery. And we got some really compelling footage of the cruel nature of this. And it's in California. So in California, there are no exemptions to the factory farming operations. Like some states will have, as you were mentioning, if like common ag exemptions, like common operations on factory farms are exempted. So California doesn't have that. Farm animals are technically protected under the same laws as dogs and cats. And so we brought it to local authorities who took the case very, very seriously. And they, based on our evidence, they did their own initial investigation going inside the facility and also found a lot of corroborating evidence and ended up impounding several, I don't know, a couple dozen ducklings. And these ducklings ended up, it was a day that they were only hatching ducklings, as it turned out, and no chickens were being hatched. But those ducklings were ended up rescued and went to farm sanctuary. So that was a really exciting component of that case, that in, a lot of these factory farms we investigate, we would love to make a difference and impact the lives of any animals immediately if we can by bringing them to a safer place. But that often it doesn't happen for many reasons. But in this case, local authorities went in and took animals out, and those animals ended up going to a sanctuary and living amazing lives with beautiful photos that we'll have to get online. But that really stands out to me as one of the key elements of that case.
Yeah, I agree. I think whenever there's a rescue opportunity, it's not just about, the animals themselves, which are, of course, it's always so great to be able to say, oh, well, this animal's life is saved. But it's that opportunity for the interactions with that animal to tell the story of all of their, brothers and sisters, literal or otherwise, who were in that facility and died. And I think, or went on to a short life and to be killed after that. But I think that's really, being able to have that level of backstory is a really unusual opportunity. And I really like it when we're able to do a rescue in that. Yeah. I also thought with that case, it was so, it really kind of hammered home for me how important it is if you have somebody who is in the system of, the government, the law enforcement system, who really cares about this and wants to, resolve it in a fair way. And I think having that kind of almost ally in the system is really important for these kinds of cases. Like, you want to be creative about how to resolve things. You want to, even if you run into trouble, we ran into trouble there because ultimately the prosecutor did not want to file any charges. Yeah. The facility itself was actually across the street from the animal services. Yeah. And which that actually was the first time I had ever been that close to, let's call it a factory farm, right? Because, you could walk by it and I could smell it. And that was my first experience sort of doing that. And I really liked the ability to, kind of bring all the material, talk it through with animal services and really try to build that. But ultimately the prosecutor did not want to file charges. So we had to go back and find another way in, and ended up filing a lawsuit, which ultimately ensured the permanent closure of the hatchery, which is, it was a big thing. And I still kind of think about that. But I think even if we're not getting into the nitty gritty of the law there, some of the things that really stick out for me are the kind of appearances, right? Like that, okay, well, of course it's going to be easy. This is Santa Cruz, and the challenges that we face despite that, but at the same time, that allyship, which I think is really important, to be able to have somebody who can sit and really think through solutions and cases with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really highlights the idea too, though, that even in a state that protects farm animals under the same laws as dogs and cats, and even with law enforcement that takes the case so seriously, they end up, going inside the facility themselves and corroborating our evidence to the point where they were able to take animals out because they were in immediate danger. And they recommend charges be filed. Even in that case, with everything going for us, the case didn't go forward. The prosecutor decided to not incline to move forward with it. So we ended up having to come up with the creative legal solution to make this happen. And it really, I think, helps highlight the idea that the system is so set up to, even in the best case scenario, it's so set up to protect factory farmers, to protect the animal ag business, and to allow it to operate without any scrutiny whatsoever. I mean, that to me, I think, is the biggest element of the work that we do, is that these places are operating with no one checking really what's going on inside the facilities, with the assumption that somebody else is doing it. The assumption that, things are happening for a reason, and that there are regulations in place that keep the checks and balances. Within reality, there are no federal laws, and even the state laws that protect farm animals are not reaching into those facilities to truly protect these animals. And so it's up to us. I mean, we are the sort of the gatekeepers of the view inside these facilities. Without our investigators going inside to document what's happening, we wouldn't be able to engage in the legal work that we do to help shut these facilities down and change these practices, and help with pushing laws to end some of the worst practices on these facilities. And, I think that's to me is, the challenge of farm animal legal advocacy is, on one hand, there's almost nothing to work with. On the other hand, once you start thinking more creatively, you can come up with ways to protect animals. But that shouldn't be the case. The system should be there. The checks and balances should be there to prevent these horrors from happening inside these facilities.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, the law is only good as its enforcement, right? I mean, there's only so much we can do as private individuals to get these existing systems to move forward. I mean, it is funny, when I first started here, I kind of was worried we'd run out of ideas for lawsuits. And
I remember that.
Never happened. That's never been the issue, right? The
I've never had a day without a million amazing ideas.
Yeah, there's just never enough time and people and resources to get these ideas to happen. But I think that's right. I think the bigger point coming out of these animal cruelty cases is that we already have laws in place that are supposed to be protecting these animals. Just because they are, considered by some who are making money off of them to be widgets in a system, does not mean that negates their identity and their value under the law. So I think, this is a good illustration of a case both where we faced really some dead ends. I mean, despite all of the other promising things, and then we were able to find a way around it to resolve these issues. I do think with that case, I always say this, that it's not the how bad the evidence is, like how much cruelty is documented, that determines whether and to what degree there is actual legal, success on getting enforcement or doing anything else with the law. But this case in particular sticks with me in that way because it was really bad. Like the kinds of suffering that those animals went through on a regular basis, and the fact that a lot of those chicks were going to companies that were higher welfare, organic, that kind of thing. And then learning that there are no standards even within the industry for hatcheries, really kind of brings all of those issues we just talked about into this sort of, wow, this is absolutely the entire industry, and this is really bad. And it doesn't matter how bad it is, you're still going to run into potentially the same kinds of issues.
Yeah. And again, this was a case that also allowed us to get significant media coverage. One of the stories actually won an award for its story, but that coverage is so vital to reach consumers, knowing that consumer action is a huge component to change. That once consumers start to learn about what's happening and demand change, then that's when the industry might start listening, because in these cases, even as we just said, the best case scenario and the best, situation, the laws sometimes, most often, fail these animals.
Yeah. And we were very, lucky to find this civil avenue in California to actually make sure this place,
So let's talk about that, because that was a really groundbreaking case that you were building, this private action that resulted in the shutdown of this hatchery, which is a huge result from this case.
Well, California has an unusually detailed law on consumer protection and unfair business practices. So we were using that law to essentially argue that you can't, it's anti-competitive behavior to make money by cutting corners by breaking the cruelty law, breaking the criminal law. So instead of, because it was very clear that we couldn't just directly enforce the criminal law, we were working around it by using these civil laws to say, no, like you need to stop doing this. And it was a really nice outcome in this case that there was an actual agreement and settlement to say permanent closure is ensured by the settlement. And I think that's something also, we've seen that idea then be used, the standing concept there, the substantive argument that was made there be used in other animal cases after that. And I think we should see more of that. And I think that also is a way to raise awareness around the issue of, the animal cruelty law applies to farmed animals.
Yeah.
And, sort of full stop, regardless of whether, law enforcement prosecutors are resistant or insecure or worried about bringing those cases. It's not, the issue is not what the law is saying. So I think that that's something that we really need to kind of carry forward as a lesson from a case like this.
Yeah.
So speaking of anti-competitive behavior, let's get into the dairy antitrust case.
Yeah, that's a good case.
So that was a little different for us, a little something new for us. What do you remember about kind of the impact of that case and what kind of message you think it carried for consumers?
The dairy industry was very openly, I mean, this is all available online, was very openly controlling the market through what was called a dairy herd retirement program. This is how we got wind of it, this dairy herd retirement program, which sounds like these cows have been milked for a while are now just going to go off to, pasture and sit in the sun and hang out and live the rest of their lives. But in reality, what the dairy herd retirement program and what we started to discover was this program was designed by these major dairy companies who were together in a cooperative, limiting the number of dairy cows in the entire market. And that then limited the amount of milk being produced or controlled it to the point where the price of milk would go up. Because if you have an oversupply, then the price of milk goes down. And that's what was happening, was there was an oversupply of milk. So the industry was working through this program, in a nutshell, to explain it, this price fixing scheme where it would control how many cows are in the system, how much milk was being produced, and help inflate artificially the price of milk. So it was I think it was $9.5 billion price fixing scheme. And that was based on the information the dairy industry had put out on its own website. Mm-hmm. And you ended up, you can share this story, but you ended up talking with a class action law firm to take it on because it was way beyond our scope and skill set. But we knew based on the research that you and your team had done that this was a pretty big case.
Yeah, we knew it was too big and too expensive to do it on our own, but we thought if we put the whole roadmap together and kind of built the idea, and actually it was, some law students that really did a lot of the work on that. And I remember that feeling of them being like, wow, like this is, the more you dig in, the bigger it is. And I think, it's something that to me was eye-opening about the dairy industry. I mean, I wasn't surprised they were killing cows. I wasn't surprised that they were doing nefarious things. But what I thought was so interesting about that case is that they were using laws that were put into place to protect small farmers from, they could be exempt from antitrust laws. It's a federal law called the kappa Act that was basically put into place to protect the ability for, let's say, a region of small farmers to get together and, kind of work together to avoid maybe foreign competition from one of the big guys, right? But they turn that on its head. They're technically made out of co-ops, but these are the big guys now, and they kind of are asking for that kind of protection. We said, no, that's not what this was for, and there was a little bit of opinions coming out about this. There was a potato case and some other things that were happening that made it clear that this was the time to do it. And I thought that, that's something that sticks with me in terms of the industry is looking for ways to find loopholes to make the big guys bigger and more influential. And we were getting phone calls from dairy farmers, individual dairy farmers, who would be like, yeah, like this is true, but I got to tell you how hard it is to be a dairy farmer. Like I'm making no money. My dream is to go work at an office for 40 hours a week or something. Because they're really being sucked dry, and this is all being concentrated around these big farmers. And that's something that stuck with me in terms of finding other lawsuits and other causes of action.
Yeah, it was helping. I mean, in addition to the price fixing and all that, it was also helping sort of consolidate the dairy industry to the few at the top who are in charge of this co-op.
Yeah. The more they were manipulating prices by reducing supply, which also was not the intention of that law, right? Like the original law was supposed to be to encourage domestic production of ag products, right? So this was a way of just kind of making money in what they thought was a safe harbor, and we were like, no, that's not how this is supposed to go.
Yeah. So once, this is what I remember, and you can clarify, but once the case, I mean, we weren't part of the case technically, but once our case was filed, there were cases filed in other states that were sort of mimicking the same idea, and eventually were they consolidated?
Yeah, so you couldn't have, like, for legal reasons, you couldn't have the same attorneys representing different sets of plaintiffs with the class action, but it was all the same concept. And then ultimately they ended up, the industry ended up settling for consumers, anybody who had purchased dairy, from
like 2003 to some 2013 or something, this 10-year period at least.
Yeah. And actually what was funny, like you said that $9.5 billion, I was remembering the charts that they put out on the website, and it was like, this is the industry program that was doing this. And it's additive. Like they were still making money years after any given round of killing. So it was going on and on forward. I don't know when they projected to even stop making money on this. Like it's crazy. But the fact that it was such a widespread thing and the settlement was large meant that there was huge media on it once the settlement happened. And we were able to talk about, what's happening in the dairy industry. A lot of people didn't really understand that cows are slaughtered in the dairy industry, right? And this is a real platform to be able to do that. I mean, I can't tell you how many like really sophisticated, interesting, like interested people, it's like, oh, of course. But they don't even realize that, the cows have to be made pregnant to keep producing milk. Like the dairy industry itself, in order to exist, has to do some really unethical things. And I think this was a good platform to being able to talk about that.
Yeah. And so that settlement, I think it was $52 million. And so consumers who filed claims, I guess, were able to recoup some of the money. But, I think it was an interesting way to expose the industry for its cruelty, but also, again, this consumer protection angle of prices are being fixed in the market so that the industry makes more money and consolidates. So it's again, it was that blend of animal cruelty and consumer protection that, this case ended up getting, its coverage for.
Yeah. And I think that allowed people to feel like they really had, kind of some engagement in this, right? Like, oh, I'm a person who, not that I am, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so they're part of the story. And I think that really helps people find a way into what otherwise might be some kind of abstract ideas and kind of figure out how to get a purchase on that.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to touch on the dairy industry just in general. I mean, the idea of the dairy industry, in order to produce milk, mammals are pregnant. And so the dairy industry is sort of like perpetuating its own oversupply in the sense that in order to get milk, they have to be impregnated. And some of those calves who are born are female, who end up going back into the dairy industry. So unless the dairy industry can somehow convince consumers to drink more milk and eat more cheese, which they're working very hard to do, there is an oversupply of milk in the system because these cows have to become pregnant in order to produce milk. And it is, we are the only species who drinks another mammal's milk. And we are the only species who drinks milk past weaning. So it's really the most unnatural product we could be consuming.
Yeah, and I think the reason that it feels so like, what is going on? Why do we do this? Is, the story is deeper than that, which is that the government does a lot to promote and support and artificially prop up the dairy industry. So the fact that we all
to the dairy industry lobbying efforts to get in there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we all grew up with this idea that somehow milk is healthy and it's natural and all that, and
it's necessary.
Right.
We need it for strong bones.
Right. So that all those programs are really also contributing to the oversupply, because there's things like price floors and insurance programs, and they purchase a lot of these products and stuff. So it all kind of, it's pulling a thread on a system that's even bigger and more complicated than that. And I think that at the end of the day is really what our legal advocacy work is supposed to be doing, is kind of dismantling systemic harms that way and exposing what those harms are. And I think hopefully the industry will realize that it has to be accountable for some of these things, the more successes we have on things that it really relies on, right? I mean, these are things that, if you take enough pieces out, the whole thing will fall. And that, I think, is the intention behind being strategic about some of these kinds of cases.
Yeah.
So let's talk about one more,
okay.
Which is the Superior False Claims Act case. That was a more recent one, a significantly more recent one. And I think the world had changed a lot between, the days of Esmond Shade and Animal Care Certified, and also hadn't changed a lot, But it was a little different for us in terms of the kind of investigation and then the kind of legal advocacy. So what will you take away from that in the future as you think about that case?
Yeah, well, this was, the largest lamb slaughterhouse in the U.S. And this type of video footage had never been exposed before in the U.S. So that in and of itself, I think, was really compelling in terms of telling a narrative for animals in the farm animal industry that aren't typically seen as farm animals. I mean, a lot of, sheep are raised for wool, but we also eat a lot of sheep, and that's often through lambs. And so it gave us a chance to have a conversation about a different type of farm animal. And it was really horrifying to see that footage. And what really stands out to me with that footage is seeing lambs who have been supposedly slaughtered, gone through the slaughter process, and now they're still being cut or their skin is being removed, and they're clearly conscious and alive. And just seeing that footage was just incredibly shocking and horrifying to me. And, we did get a lot of media coverage out of that. It was a great New York Times story. It was another case in California where technically these animals should be protected just like dogs and cats. And again, that the system failed them. And, you have a lot more intimate knowledge about the legal advocacy that came as a result of that. But that was definitely a groundbreaking case involving a Department of Justice intervention.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting in the context of talking about this with Esmond Shade. We had an additional hurdle here if we were trying to get the state criminal law enforced, because this is a federally inspected slaughterhouse. And every time we've done an investigation, for example, Central Valley Meat was also a California federally inspected slaughterhouse. We really get nowhere with the local law enforcement on that. So that's just sort of an interesting nugget, because then we have to then look at, well, what can we do otherwise? What can we do legally? Just like we did with CalCruz, right? Like, now we're stuck here. What can we do otherwise? And I think this case was interesting because it had that, possibility to use the False Claims Act, and that we were
which is new to a lot of people. I don't think most. I think that was newer to me back in the Hallmark case, what a False Claims Act really was. But I think it's potentially underutilized. I think you've said this, a potentially underutilized action. So, maybe share, what is the False Claims Act?
Yeah, well, I'll just say that Hallmark case, which is the Humane Society's case, to our knowledge, was the first time the False Claims Act was ever used for factory farming, meat.
Yeah.
Issues, which is so interesting, because there's really no reason that had to be the case. It was a big kind of departure, I guess, from what that law was normally used for. The law is really meant to protect the government. It's meant to protect the government's interests from being defrauded, being overcharged for something. And so every time one of these big slaughterhouses is selling to the government, there's a contract in place. And in a number of our investigations and other groups' investigations, that's in play. So, these are contracts that go for food for things like the National School Lunch Program. So, as a person who's bringing new information to the government, you can go to court and say, hey, on behalf of the government's losing money because of a materially problematic issue. I mean, more or less. So we were able to, our allegations were that there were violations of the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act and 2 other food safety related claims. And the Department of Justice actually intervened, which they do in a minority of cases, and led to a settlement and a consent decree in that case. And I think that certainly should be and could be a model for future cases, whether they're done by us or others. I hope both. I hope there's a lot more cases of this type happening in the future. But I think, there's so many unique elements of that investigation as well. And I think there's so much that didn't get to really be fully figured out on the legal side, like what the ritual slaughter methods look like. I mean, there's a law in place that specifically lays out, the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act specifically lays out what ritual slaughter is acceptable. But there's some really interesting nuances to that and open questions. And I think that just kind of opened the door to many other things that could happen in the future.
Yeah. And I think this case, one thing that I also remember from it is part of the investigation included footage in which the final product is supposed to go through a metal detector to verify that it's free of metal. And on one hand, that sounds really odd, but you see a lot of meat recalls because of metal particles in the product. So that's why this happens. And so the investigation showed that a lot of those, products were being taken out of a box. Some went on a conveyor belt through the metal detector, and some just completely bypassed the metal detector and didn't go through. And then there were dates that were changed on some of the, I don't know if it was sell by or one of those, sort of
best by dates.
Food safety dates were being changed. And so that brings up the whole element of, while we're undercover, investigators are largely there to document the day-to-day cruelty, a lot of the interactions with the animals and the inherent systems of abuse, we're also uncovering potential food safety concerns as well. And so that, that reminds me of other investigations where we documented, really alarming potential food safety concerns. So, I mean, these are systems that are just, pushing a product out the door for profit making. And there's so much cutting corners to save time and to save money that it's,
it really is a lot of corner cutting. And I think, I always kind of go back to the fact that it's so few investigators or groups that are out there doing these investigations for any reason, right? We're obviously doing it. Our kind of center of gravity is for the animals, but of course we're interested in all of these other issues that come up. But, you could come to the factory farm issue for a number of reasons. And I think investigations reveal a lot of the picture for things that are not necessarily even directly related to animal treatment. So that's something that we should get into in talk 4. We're talking about investigations, but I think this is a good place to stop for the legal advocacy. And it is sort of an interesting, intersection between the two issues. So I think this is a good kind of to be continued. And we'll get into investigations and some of the key highlights there and some of the takeaways there. But thank you so much for this.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for number 4.
All right.